Escape from Pretoria, the real prison break that inspired the film, The Walls of Pretoria. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and join the channel that exposes the real stories behind the world's most daring escapes. Because after this one, you'll never look at a prison the same way again. Pretoria, South Africa, 1979. The air was thick with tension, heat, and politics. Behind the walls of one of the most secure prisons in the country, two men sat in silence, each trapped for crimes that weren't violent, but defiant. Their names were Timothy Jenkins and Stephen Lee. Both were white South Africans, educated, articulate, and dangerous in a way the government feared most. They weren't thieves or murderers. They were anti-apartheid activists, men who had used leaflets, typewriters, and printing presses to expose the racial injustice their country was built on. In the eyes of the regime, they were traitors. In the eyes of history, they would become something else entirely. Tim Jenkins was a thinker, calm, precise, and methodical. A former sociology student turned political rebel. He had been caught after secretly printing hundreds of pamphlets denouncing the apartheid system and distributing them in public spaces. Stephen Lee, slightly older, was bold, clever, and quietly daring, a man whose calm exterior hid an iron determination. Both men knew they didn't belong in Pretoria Central Prison, a place built to break men, not reform them. The cells were small, the guards brutal, and the tension constant. But it wasn't the cruelty that terrified them most. It was the hopelessness. Every morning, the metallic clank of cell doors echoed through the corridors. Prisoners were marched in silence to work details, under the glare of wardens who carried rifles as if they were an extension of their arms. To Tim and Stephen, escape wasn't just about survival, it was about defiance. If they could break out of Pretoria Prison, the symbol of apartheid's control, they could send a message louder than any pamphlet ever could. But escape seemed impossible. Every door was locked with heavy, double-bolted mechanisms. Each hallway had guards, keys, alarms, and dogs. The cells themselves were designed to contain men indefinitely. Until, one night, Tim Jenkins noticed something. While watching a guard close the cell door, he caught a glimpse of the key. Its teeth glinted in the dim light for only a second, but that second was enough. Tim studied the pattern, the spacing, the movement of the lock. That tiny observation became the spark of something extraordinary. He turned to Stephen and whispered, "What if we made our own?" Stephen frowned. "Our own key?" Tim nodded. "Exactly like theirs. Every door, every lock. Out of wood." It sounded insane. But insanity was the only freedom they had left. The next weeks became an obsession. The two men scavenged materials from the prison workshop, scraps of wood, bits of paper, anything that could be shaped or carved. They smuggled them back into their cells, hiding pieces under floorboards and behind loose bricks. Jenkins began carving in secret. Using the few tools available, a file, a knife, and pure patience, he shaped each key by memory. He would test the fit at night when the guards passed, feeling for every click, every fraction of resistance. It took months. One wrong curve, one misplaced cut, and it would all fail. But Tim was relentless. He carved 10 keys, each matching a different door, from the cell block to the outer gate. To test them, they had to risk everything. At midnight, Stephen would stand watch while Tim inserted a key into the first lock. The sound of metal scraping against metal in that silence was deafening. One twist too loud, and they'd be shot where they stood. But the key turned. Then another. And another. Each door they conquered brought them closer to the idea of freedom. The other prisoners began to whisper, rumors of something impossible being planned. Even the guards noticed that Tim and Stephen had grown quiet, focused. One officer searched their cell once, twice, even 3 times, but found nothing. They had hidden their tools in plain sight, inside hollowed-out table legs and beneath the rim of a toilet. Every night they studied the routine of the guards, the timing of footsteps, the distance of radios, the sound of keys jingling. They memorized everything, because one mistake meant execution. Then, in December 1979, the final key was ready. The two men stood in their cell, staring at the small collection of wooden keys laid neatly on a cloth. Each one was labeled and carved to perfection. Tim looked at Stephen and whispered, "Once we open the first door, there's no turning back." Stephen nodded. "Then let's make history." They waited until the lights went out. The prison hummed with silence, that heavy, electric silence that comes before a storm. Tim took the first key, pressed it into the lock, and turned. A soft click. Then another door. And another. Each one opened like a whisper from fate itself. They moved slowly, breathless, navigating through the maze of corridors they had memorized by heart. Each door was a victory. Each lock, a heartbeat. Until they reached the final corridor, the one that led to the outer wall. They were one door away from freedom. But as Tim reached for the last key, they heard footsteps echoing down the hall. A flashlight beam cut through the dark. A guard was coming straight toward them. Tim froze, the key trembling in his hand. Stephen's eyes widened. The entire plan, months of work, risk, and rebellion, hung on the sound of that single approaching step. And when the guard stopped at the end of the hallway and turned his light toward them, everything changed. The escape. The hallway was silent, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Tim Jenkins pressed the carved key into the steel door and turned it, slowly, carefully, like a surgeon guiding a blade. The lock gave a quiet metallic click. He froze. Then, another. The door opened. For months, they'd lived in a world of whispers, hiding every tool, every scrap, every trace of what they were building. Now, in the dead of night, all that patience balanced on the edge of discovery. Behind them, their cell stood empty, perfectly made bed, toothbrush aligned on the sink, even a folded shirt left neatly as if they were asleep. To the guards, it would look ordinary, until morning. Tim and Stephen moved through the corridors with precision, counting every step. They knew the guard's schedule by heart. They'd studied their boots against the concrete to mask the sound of their own. Every hallway was a gamble. Every turn could end in death. They passed the first checkpoint. Then the second. The air was thick with tension. At the workshop gate, Tim slipped another key into the lock. The wood pressed against the metal with a faint creak. He twisted, it jammed. Sweat gathered on his temple. Stephen glanced over his shoulder, panic creeping in. Tim adjusted, turned again, click. The gate opened. The workshop was dark, filled with the smell of oil and metal. Their makeshift route ran through it, down a narrow corridor to a storage drain that led beneath the outer wall. They'd studied it for weeks, timing when guards passed by outside. It was their only chance. They crawled through the maintenance shaft, air thick with dust and grease. The metal scraped against their elbows. Every inch forward felt like an eternity. When they reached the vertical duct, Tim pulled a rope they'd hidden behind a pipe. They climbed slowly, emerging behind a heavy iron grill. Beyond that grill, freedom. Tim used the smallest key, one he'd carved by memory after only glimpsing it for half a second. It fit perfectly. The grill swung open. Cool night air flooded in. They crawled out into the open, onto the roof of a storage shed near the wall. Beyond them was darkness, fields, and the faint sound of traffic far in the distance. For the first time in months, they could see the stars. But it wasn't over. One last wall stood between them and the outside world, the main perimeter fence lined with barbed wire. Guards patrolled it with flashlights that swept across the yard every 30 seconds. They waited, counting the rhythm. One light passed. Another. On the next cycle, they ran. Their bare feet slapped against the cold concrete, shadows blending with the dark. They climbed the fence, hands slicing open on wire. The alarms hadn't sounded yet. Just one more push. Then a flashlight beam cut through the dark. "Hey! Who's there?" A shout echoed across the yard. Tim's heart exploded in his chest. Stephen dropped down first, landing hard on the other side. "Go," he hissed. Tim hesitated for a split second, then jumped. They tumbled into the brush as gunfire erupted behind them. The bullets cracked the night air, sparks flaring against the fence. But they didn't stop. They ran through the fields, down a dirt road, breath burning, lungs screaming. Behind them, the sirens began to wail. Pretoria Prison was awake. They had 5 minutes, maybe less, before searchlights flooded the fields. They ditched their uniforms in a ditch and changed into the plain clothes they'd hidden days earlier. Mud streaked their faces. For hours, they kept running. Past factories, train lines, and shadowed alleys. Dogs barked in the distance. Every sound felt like a heartbeat counting down to capture. At dawn, they found a small abandoned house outside the city. They collapsed inside, drenched in sweat and disbelief. Tim pressed his back against the wall, listening to the faint echoes of police sirens somewhere far away. They had done it. They were free. But freedom came with a price. They were now fugitives in a country where every border was watched, and every road could lead to death. As the morning light broke through the dusty windows, Stephen whispered, "We can't stay here. We keep moving until we hit the border." Tim nodded. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the realization that they had done the impossible. Behind them, in the heart of Pretoria Prison, guards were still unlocking doors, searching cells, shouting names. When they reached cell 16, they froze. The lock was unbroken. The bed, untouched. The men, gone. For the first time in its history, Pretoria had been breached. But while the walls of the prison remained, something greater had cracked that night, the illusion that tyranny was absolute. And somewhere, deep in the countryside, 2 men disappeared into the rising African sun, armed only with courage, a compass, and an idea too powerful to contain. The aftermath. When dawn broke over Pretoria, the sound of sirens cut through the still air. Guards sprinted through hallways, shouting orders, slamming cell doors, demanding head counts. 2 names echoed off the stone walls, Jenkins. Lee. They were gone. Within hours, search teams were deployed across the city. Police dogs sniffed through nearby fields. Military checkpoints sprang up on every road leading north. The apartheid regime had been embarrassed, 2 political prisoners had made fools of their unbreakable system. But Tim Jenkins and Stephen Lee were no longer prisoners. They were ghosts. They spent the first night in a culvert, hiding beneath a bridge as soldiers searched above. Each time headlights swept across the water, they held their breath. The cold crept into their bones, but the thrill of freedom kept them awake. When morning came, they moved. They stuck to back roads, farms, and dirt tracks, using false names and disguises. Each day, they grew more desperate. They rationed water, stole bits of food from unattended kitchens, and traveled only by night. Every sound felt like a betrayal, a barking dog, a passing truck, a voice in the distance. At one point, they took shelter in an old farmhouse. An elderly man found them the next morning, staring out from behind cracked glasses. He didn't call the police. He brought them bread. "Go," he whispered. "You don't belong here anymore." It was the first act of quiet rebellion they'd seen outside the prison walls, proof that not all South Africans agreed with the regime that had caged them. News spread fast. Newspapers across the country ran front-page headlines. Escape from Pretoria, 2 men vanish from maximum security. The government tried to downplay it, calling the pair terrorists, who would soon be caught. But secretly, officials were panicking. The international press picked up the story within days. The BBC, The Guardian, and even the New York Times ran reports calling the escape a miracle of precision and courage. The apartheid government had lost control of the narrative. Meanwhile, Tim and Stephen were still on the run, slowly making their way toward the Mozambique border, hundreds of miles away. They found help from members of the anti-apartheid underground, activists who risked everything to smuggle them between safe houses. Some of these helpers were university students, others were priests, farmers, and even ex-soldiers disgusted by what they'd seen. For 3 weeks, they moved from town to town, crossing rivers and mountain roads, sometimes on foot, sometimes hidden in trucks carrying goods to the coast. Finally, one night, under a moonless sky, they reached a stretch of barbed wire marking the border. On the other side, freedom. Stephen went first, cutting through the wire with a smuggled pair of pliers. Tim followed, his hands trembling, whispering, "We're almost there." When they reached Mozambique, they collapsed in silence. They were free men on foreign soil. For days, they stayed hidden, waiting for confirmation that they weren't being followed. Then, with help from British diplomats, they flew to London. There, they faced cameras for the first time, not as fugitives, but as symbols. They spoke not of revenge, but of truth. They described the tortures, the propaganda, the fear that filled Pretoria's walls. Their story shocked the world and rallied even more people to the anti-apartheid cause. In 1994, when apartheid finally fell, their names were remembered not as criminals, but as men who had defied injustice with nothing but courage and intellect. Years later, Tim Jenkins wrote Inside Out, Escape from Pretoria Prison. He described the moment they crossed the border in one haunting line. "When we looked back, we realized we hadn't escaped prison. We'd escaped silence." Their story was turned into a major motion picture decades later, reintroducing their defiance to a new generation. But no film could capture the raw, breathless terror of that night, or the impossible hope that guided them through it. Today, visitors to the old prison can see the wooden keys, preserved in glass. Beneath them, a plaque reads, "Freedom isn't granted. It's built." And though the prison remains, the myth of control it represented is gone, chipped away, just like the walls that failed to hold them. Because sometimes, escape isn't just about leaving a place. It's about proving that the human spirit can't be locked away. If you thought this escape was brilliant, wait until you hear about the next one, a prisoner who built an entire crime empire from inside his cell. Hit subscribe, and prepare for a story even darker than freedom.